And tonight we continue our examination of ESG, which, as I've told you, makes CRT look like your grade school ABCs. This is really an insidious program that is going beyond the legislative process. It's getting into our major corporation, and it's changing our very country. I'm not overstating the case. In fact, Hild, who's the executive director of Consumers Research, he'll back me up here. He knows, right? Will, I'm not overstating the case. This is changing our country through...
You're not overstating it at all, Larry.
Thank you.
This is absolutely an undermining of the entire American way of life.
So remind everybody again what ESG is, and then we'll talk about the insidious way this policy is sort of affecting our country outside of our government's control.
Absolutely. Well, ESG stands for Environmental Social Governance, and it's billed by its proponents, its supporters, as simply a style of investing like value investing that Warren Buffett is famous for, or momentum investing, or technical trading, right? What it actually is a Trojan horse for people like Larry Fink of BlackRock to inject politics into the corporate boardroom and simply to turn all of corporate America into a political utility for the Democratic Party.
And basically what they're doing is they're compelling companies to adopt certain woke policies lest they lose their financing and lose their financial support. Is it that simple?
That's correct. So take, for example, BlackRock, led by CEO Larry Fink. They have aggregated, they sort of hoovered up a ton of public pension dollars, both at the local, state, but also the federal level. They manage about 80% of the federal thrift savings plan. That's the pension fund for military and federal employees. And so they're managing public dollars, but then they use those dollars to push political priorities. So let's say they own 7.5% of Exxon. Well, last year, they used those shares that they're managing for other people to vote on 3 radical environmentalists to the board of Exxon, whose stated goal is to get that company out of the business of oil and gas discovery and recovery for the American consumer and into expensive boondoggle technologies that don't work, that are more expensive, like solar panels and wind farms. This is going to increase costs for consumers. It's going to reduce returns for these pensioners that Larry Fink and BlackRock owe fiduciary duty to. The only people that profit are the Democratic Party and Larry Fink.
And by the way, isn't it funny? I mean, if you made up the name of an evil corporation that is infiltrating all these things, you would say BlackRock, but it's really what's happening here. I said that this is happening outside of the confines of legislation and government control, and that may be the case, but it certainly helps one party over the other, and certainly Democrats and the Biden administration, they're encouraging this, aren't they? They're cheerleading for this.
Absolutely. This is really a government-private partnership to enforce, austerity and higher costs and lower standard of living on American consumers. During the Trump administration, they had something called faith liaisons that were at every agency that Trump appointed. Well, Biden administration has replaced them with their own faith liaisons, their climate faith, the climate religion.
Yeah.
And so there's a climate liaison at every agency, and you're seeing the results of that from the Office of the Comptroller of Currency to the MSRB to the Department of Labor. They're all pushing out regulations that are meant to ensconce ESG as a matter of law. I wouldn't be surprised if the Bureau of Printing and Engraving is going to start putting out ESG regulations soon, because you've seen this coming out of all kinds of agencies that are not, instead of focusing on their mission, are trying to push ESG priorities.
So, for instance, earlier this week when the president announced he was releasing another several million barrels of petroleum from the Petroleum Reserve, he was challenged by a reporter. Why not just drill our own oil here? And he said, hey, we haven't done anything to slow down or stop domestic drilling. And that may be technically true, but his influence and the influence of the administration with these ESG Climate Czars talking about how they're going to end the oil industry, that then manifests into these banks and finance companies saying, hey, we don't want to have anything to do with this.
Absolutely. So what they're doing is by injecting ESG scoring, which penalizes oil and gas investments, into all kinds of regulations, they are choking off the capital that the oil and gas industry needs in order to invest in these projects. These are multi-year projects that need financing, and much of that comes through big banks that are themselves regulated by a number of different agencies. And so that lending, those lending standards, are being changed by the Biden administration to intentionally penalize oil and gas industry.
Yeah.
But it doesn't just stop there. Anything that's blue collar, really, agriculture, mining and extraction, manufacturing, these are all going to be penalized by an ESG structure. And so, from the gas pump to the grocery store and everywhere in between, these ESG standards and these ESG regulations are raising costs on consumers. So it's both a product of the actions of Wall Street fat cats like Larry Fink and also the Biden administration.
All right, so your organization is called Consumers Research, and you try to empower consumers to sort of take this back. Because listen, these companies, they're big, they're huge, they're mighty, they've got all the dollars, but ultimately they still need us. If we choose to go elsewhere, if we choose to take our business elsewhere, that hurts them, and it hurts them big time. So do we have that kind of influence? Can we mobilize and actually pick and choose who we're going to spend our dollars with? Or, if I can do a compound question for you, is this up to maybe larger entities like state governments? We had the treasurer of West Virginia on earlier this week to talk about this. You talk about mining, extraction, rural industry. That's what West Virginia is all about. And he said, no, we're not going to have anything to do with these companies that force the ESG scores. Is that how this changes? You tell me.
Yeah, it's a both and. So there are certain companies that are particularly vulnerable to their customers simply walking away. We saw that with PayPal backtracking with the ridiculous excuse that they accidentally sent out a clause that would allow them to steal $2,500 from their customers if they didn't like what they said on social media. That company had to come up with a ridiculous story in order to backtrack from that. I think that was in response to a rapid loss of customers. Companies like BlackRock are susceptible to larger actions, and we've seen increasing number of those. As you mentioned, West Virginia Treasurer, Louisiana Treasurer, the Missouri Treasurer, the Texas Comptroller. Those have all been moving money, public money that's being managed by BlackRock, out of those hands and saying, no more are you going to use our dollars to attack our state's interests and our consumers' interests. And so it's a both and. We need to punish companies that are retail facing like PayPal when they do things like what we saw a couple weeks ago. We also need to communicate to our elected officials that we care about these issues, that it matters to us whether our money is being used against our interests, and support them when they do take these actions. Because I can assure you, BlackRock is not going to take it sitting down. They have a ton of money and they're going to fight back. But ultimately, we are the ones with the power because it's our money, it's our dollars that they're using against our interests.
Will, we've spoken before, and what I love about you and what you're doing at Consumers Research is you name names. And at your website, can we go there right now and see who the good guys and bad guys are here so we can empower ourselves?
Absolutely. We'd love for people to find out more about the ways in which BlackRock is undermining their interests. They can go to, very simply, aboutblackrock.com. That's aboutblackrock.com, and find out more about the ways in which BlackRock is using your dollars to undermine your interests.
Well, and if we could, to that end, I'd love for you to take in our final minute here a victory lap, because last time we spoke, you were calling out Coca-Cola for their ridiculous crusade against the people of Georgia over their voting integrity laws that were put in place. A whole bunch of companies were pushing back on Georgia. And now Georgia's opened up their early voting, and they've been overwhelmed by the highest turnout ever. So where's all that voter suppression Coca-Cola promised us?
Yeah, it was completely ridiculous. They had let a number of rogue employees use that company as a political utility. I think subsequent to our campaign, they fired the general counsel that was pushing a lot of this nonsense. And it looks like the company has tried to clean house a little bit and get back on focusing on serving their customers, not woke politicians, which our message all along. All right. So it's good to see companies change course.
Thanks, Hild. Good stuff. More to come on O'Connor tonight.